Presumably, that's because Bitcoin is so thoroughly decentralized. But that naturally raises the question, where on the decentralization continuum does a token cease to be a security? And most of these tokens don't even have a financial claim on the issuer. Doesn't that make these tokens very different from at least the vast majority of ordinary securities? And if the chairman is right that most tokens should be considered securities, then as he himself states in his written testimony, and I quote, "It follows that many crypto intermediaries are transacting in securities and have to register with the SEC in some capacity," end quote. But crypto transactions typically can be settled in real time on chain and without intermediaries. As a result, crypto intermediaries often serve different customer needs, they've got different business models, and they pose different risks than traditional securities intermediaries. All of that raises the question, what is the crypto-specific roadmap for these crypto intermediaries to register? Stepping back, I think there's a larger problem here. As Bloomberg columnist Matt Levine put it, and I quote, "Chairman Gensler's posture is that he should be in charge of writing the rules for crypto, but not write them. I just don't see how that can work," end quote. I think Mr. Levine has a good point. Given the novel nature of these tokens, really Congress ought to step in and provide clarity. In particular, we need to revisit the definition of security as part of a larger effort to tailor a regulatory framework that is calibrated to the unique risks and activities of the crypto market. As I've said, crypto tokens have varying degrees of decentralization. They usually do not have a financial claim on the issuer and typically can be settled in real time without intermediaries. These are very major and important differences from traditional securities, and they merit a clearly stated and tailored regulatory framework. Now, while the SEC has failed to provide the regulatory clarity in the crypto markets, it's been issuing numerous controversial and burdensome rules and proposed rules in the ordinary securities market. Top of that list is the SEC's climate disclosure rule. Public companies are already required, legally required, to disclose material climate change information. The proposed rule, however, would go much further to require disclosure of exceedingly extensive global warming data. Now, this data will be enormously expensive to collect, but almost none of it will be material to a business's finances. For annual reports alone, the SEC estimates that aggregate external compliance costs for issuers will increase from $1.9 billion per year to $5.2 billion per year if the SEC's proposed climate disclosure rule becomes effective. The SEC itself, again, estimates that the external compliance cost of a company going public will increase by more than 5 times at a time when excessive regulatory costs are already resulting in ever fewer companies going public. The cost of compliance will be more material to the investor than the information itself. But, of course, the climate disclosure rule isn't really about informed investment decision. It's about equipping climate activists with data to run political pressure campaigns against companies, which will often be to the detriment of shareholders. The end game is to discourage capital investment in oil, in natural gas, and other traditional energy industries, and we've seen how well that's working out in Europe. The SEC is wading into controversial public policy debates that are far outside its mission and its expertise, and they're doing it without the legal authority to do so. And in the process, the SEC risks politicizing the agency, slowing economic growth, increasing inflation, and possibly even undermining national security. So given the importance of these issues, Banking Committee Republicans have written to the SEC asking basic questions about how the SEC developed the climate disclosure rule. Instead of providing real substantive answers, the SEC has been stonewalling us. Well, the SEC may not want to answer to Congress on its climate disclosure rule, but ultimately, the SEC will have to answer to the courts, which should make it nervous. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held, and I quote, "Congress does not alter the fundamental details of a regulatory scheme in vague terms or ancillary provisions. It does not, one might say, hide elephants in mouse holes," end quote. This summer, the Supreme Court applied this sensible principle in the West Virginia versus EPA case. There, it ruled that the executive branch and its agencies cannot use novel interpretations of existing law to pretend that they've got a legal authority to support sweeping policy changes, including on climate change, that Congress never intended. Well, that's precisely what the SEC appears to be trying to do with its climate disclosure rule. The SEC should consider itself to be on notice by the court that the separation of powers still exists and will be upheld. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Today we'll hear from Securities and Exchange Commission Chair Gary Gensler. This is his annual trip here, but he sometimes does that more often, and we thank him for that. Chair Gensler, you're particularly welcome because we have a very good, well above average turnout today, so enjoy that. But thank you for joining us, Chair Gensler.
Chair Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, I'm honored to appear here before you today. I want to start just by thanking you, this committee and all of Congress, for confirming our two new commissioners, Mark Ueda, who I know worked up here on the Hill, Jaime Lizarga, who worked on the other side of the Capitol for 32 years. Terrific commissioners. It's welcome that we have a full complement. As is customary, I want to say that I'm speaking for myself. I don't speak on behalf of the fellow commissioners or the staff in this hearing. I'd like to start by just discussing two key years in policymaking a while back, 1933, 1934. I think it was when Chair Fletcher sat in this seat, Chair Brown, if I recall my history right. But it was in the middle of the Great Depression, and President Roosevelt and Congress addressed the crisis through a number of landmark reforms. And among them, Congress and FDR came together to craft the first two federal securities laws. 1933, President Roosevelt also suspended the use of the gold standard. In other words, in those two critical years, one could say that we replaced one gold standard with, I'd like to say, another, the securities laws. I really do believe the core principles of the securities markets have contributed to America's economic success and geopolitical standing. There was a basic bargain in there that investors get to decide on what risks they want to take, but there is a cop on the beat in securities laws where there was full, fair, and truthful disclosure. As we execute our mission to protect investors, maintain fair and orderly, efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation, we cannot take the leadership for granted, though. Even gold medalists, especially gold medalists, constantly train to stay ahead of the competition. And I do thank Senator Kennedy and Van Hollen to help us a little bit with this issue with China. We must remain vigilant to opportunities to drive greater efficiency, integrity, resiliency across our remit. First, markets work best when they are efficient. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's competition, there's transparency in the middle of the market. When we lower the cost in the middle, that means issuers have lower cost to raise money and investors get better returns. So we've done a lot, but we have not updated our national market system, our equity system, in 17 years. Imagine if you had in your pocket a phone that was 17 years old. You'd think, oh my God, maybe I should update that phone. Technology moves fast. We're also looking at the efficiency of our treasury market and, yes, our private funds market. Issuers and investors also would benefit from greater competition because it lowers the cost of capital, as I said. Second, our system works best when there's integrity in the market. And hence, we have rule proposals to bring greater integrity into the market around special purpose acquisition companies, the insiders, trading plans, and so forth. But another area is crypto, as Ranking Member Toomey raised. Of the nearly 10,000 tokens in the crypto market, I do believe that the vast majority are securities. Offers and sales of these securities tokens are covered by the securities laws. And given that, as the Ranking Member quoted me as saying, it follows that many crypto intermediaries are transacting in securities and have to register with the SEC in some capacity. I would note when Chair Fletcher was in that seat, there was not central electronic clearing, and you could actually exchange the security person to person in a paper form. Thus, staff is working with market participants to help ensure investors get time-tested protections in the market. In that work, and any work that Congress does, I do think we have to make sure that we don't inadvertently undermine the securities laws underlying a $100 trillion capital market. We can't. That's the sort of mother lode. That's our capital markets. Crypto is 1/100th that size. Third, markets work best when they're resilient, both in normal times and stress. We've seen those stresses in 2008 and 2020. History tells us no doubt we'll have stresses again in the future. That's just the nature of economics and finance. Thus, we have a number of projects on resiliency. This includes shortening the settlement cycle. This includes the work we're doing in the treasury markets. It includes the work we're doing around money market funds and open-end funds and cybersecurity. In all our work, we are anchored by the laws Congress pass, the court's interpretation of those laws, economic analysis, and public input. And as the commission, we benefit greatly from public input, including from Congress and this committee members. And I stand ready to meet with any of you one-on-one, nearly any time you want. We benefit from that feedback. Our capital markets are the gold standard. Let's do everything we can to keep them that way. I thank you. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Chair Gensler. And I think that what you said, and I've heard you say this before in smaller groups, publicly, bigger groups, that we can't allow the crypto market to undermine the $100 trillion capital market. That's fundamentally our job here. Consumer protections, all that, but fundamentally that is our job in the Banking, Housing, Urban Affairs Committee, and that is yours. You've made improving transparency and corporate disclosures a priority in addition to the climate risk disclosures, enhanced stock buyback information I mentioned earlier. The Commission is addressing cybersecurity risks, improving visibility, if you will, into concentrated ownership of stocks. Discuss briefly why it's critical that we improve these types of disclosures for investments, large and small investors, and for how markets operate.
I would say there's two core things, and it goes back to our founding. One was this basic bargain that investors get to decide as long as they get the full and fair disclosure, material disclosures, but full and fair disclosures, and they get to decide, and you can't defraud them and mislead them. That lowers the cost of capital, actually, because then there's trust in the market. The second thing that transparency does is it helps promote competition in the markets. And competition, that's the nature of things. It promotes our economies as well. And that competition amongst intermediaries, amongst people trying to raise money from the public. And so I'd say those are the two things, not to mention also market integrity.
Thank you. I've noticed today, I commented, and Senator Toomey has confirmed this, that we will see an unusually high turnout of Republicans for this hearing today. I think that the turnout of Republicans, many of whom against all evidence, many Republican senators, many of whom against all evidence are climate deniers, will, I would assume, ask you questions about that. But let me go with that. On climate risk disclosure, specifically discuss why your agency is what you're proposing is not, quote, making climate policy, but rather how improving disclosure helps all investors.
Well, it's because that right now, hundreds of companies and investors representing not trillions, but tens of trillions of dollars of assets under management are in this conversation already. Investors get to decide. We're not a merit regulator. Some people think we might be. We're not. We're a disclosure-based regulator. But investors today want to know about climate risk because it matters to the future path of the performance, financial and other performance. What are customers going to do? What is the supply chain going to do? What might happen around the globe? Because our U.S. issuers are operating in many jurisdictions around the globe. So it really does go back into when I buy or sell a stock or vote a proxy, climate risk matters to those investors. We have a role to help bring some consistency to those disclosures that are already happening.
You're clearly saying you are not a merit regulator, but a disclosure regulator is really important here, and I hope my colleagues remember that you said that and think that through as they ask their questions. Let me ask for crypto in the last minute and a half. The crypto markets touch securities and banking and commodities laws. My colleagues developed legislation, as you know, that would give the CFTC jurisdiction over part of the crypto market. Remind us why it's important. I'll ask two questions together so you can take the last minute and a half. Remind us why it's important for financial regulators to coordinate oversight to make sure that gaps or loopholes don't exist. And just would you agree to continue to work with our committee, the CFTC, and the banking regulators to make sure we get this right?
I do commit to that. Let me just say, when I say that it's important to protect and ensure that the $100 trillion securities market works, it's because that's the heart of how we price risk in our financial markets and how investors save. And this committee and the House Financial Services Committee oversees that and wrote into law that there was one cop on the beat, one regulator. The definition of security should be, I think, kind of the exclusive remit of these two committees, I'm looking across the aisle, and the agency that you set up. If we end up with that there's multiple federal agencies defining what a security is, and another agency tries to define it, it could undermine what we're doing as to when is a Treasury security a security, when is something else in the equity markets or elsewhere a security. To your question about working together, we work together with the other federal financial regulators. We just yesterday announced something in the Treasury markets that we worked hand in glove with the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. We, with the CFTC, I was honored to chair that agency. I love the agency, the CFTC. I love the SEC. It's like my three daughters. But I do want to say that we work closely with the CFTC with regard to a recent rule that we put out. And there are many parties in the markets that are dual registrants. We have dual broker-dealer registrants. They're registered with the CFTC and us. So as well on the fund advisory side. If Congress moved forward to give the CFTC greater authority, let's say over Bitcoin, then we'd of course work together, but we've already worked together dually on a number of enforcement actions in the crypto space.
Thank you. One brief statement. Your testimony mentioned the Enforcement Division shrank by 5% over the last 5 years. Yet, despite that, the SEC has pursued new cases in crypto focused on fraud and misconduct of financial professionals and securing admissions of guilt. That doesn't happen often enough. I thank you for doing that. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, in your written statement, you acknowledged, as you have in the past, that there are some tokens that are not securities. And I know your view that whether or not a digital asset is a security is a facts and circumstances analysis. I know your view that the SEC has very broad authority. But you've also made it clear in the past that Bitcoin is not a security. Now, some SEC staff have also previously said that Ethereum is not a security. The SEC's Dow report characterizes Ethereum as decentralized. So here's my question briefly, and without getting deep into the weeds on this, and I acknowledge your belief that most tokens have a large degree of central control, but generally speaking, is it fair to say that a significant factor for you in whether or not a digital asset is a security is whether it is centrally controlled or decentralized?
Well, I look to the Supreme Court that's often written about this, probably close to a dozen times in 50 years, and it's whether the investing public is anticipating profits, and that includes anticipating profits from appreciation as well as from, as you mentioned, rights, based upon a common enterprise, but
right.
The efforts of that common enterprise.
Right. So I guess another way to put my question, which you haven't answered, is it possible to have a common enterprise if it's something is decentralized? How could I have a common enterprise? I mean, it doesn't isn't centralization necessary to constitute a common enterprise?
You could have some things that are quite open, but still have, if the public is anticipating a profit based upon that common enterprise. So I'm being careful with my words here to be accurate as best I can. The common enterprise, are you relying on a group of individuals? And look, these are not laundromat tokens. There is a group of people that are actually—
You're not answering my question, though. But so let me try it this way. What is it about Bitcoin that causes you to conclude it is not a security?
Well, one is there's no group of individuals in the middle.
Right, it's
there's
decentralized.
no group of individuals in the middle.
Right.
That are basically, and you're not, in essence, the investing public's not betting on somebody in the middle or six people in the middle.
So you're choosing not to use the term decentralized, but that's what you're describing. It is the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, I think, is really what you're getting at. Here's my point, and I'm going to run out of time here. But there are a lot of projects, as you know, that, I mean, decentralization and centralization occurs on a continuum, really, I think. And you've acknowledged that there are tokens, plural, that are not securities. I think it's because of this centralization that you come to this conclusion. And my point is, it is not reasonable to fail to provide clarity, to provide the definition of exactly where on this continuum you have a sufficient common enterprise that it qualifies as a security and where you don't. You've said Bitcoin doesn't. Some of your colleagues have said Ethereum doesn't. But a reasonable developer who wants to comply with this doesn't know where that line is drawn.
So I think where we might have a difference is there are many factors, and so it's not one spectrum of centralization versus decentralization. What the Supreme Court, and I try to stick to, they're the Supreme Court, and there'll be debates about other laws. I try to stick to what they say, a common enterprise. I think about a group of individuals in the middle. That developer is in the middle, and the investing public's betting on them, counting on them, even if the token might be on 1,000 computers. That's not what the Supreme Court's looking at. It's not about the token being on 1,000 computers. It's just like a group of developers in the middle.
But if there is nobody controlling it in the middle, that's what we call decentralized, and that does happen. As you know, of course, the Howey test requires all four of the tests to be met in order for something to be defined as a security. Let me move on to another related issue, which is, as I said in my opening statement, I don't think that the SEC has provided a crypto-specific roadmap to the registration of crypto intermediaries. One example of the problem that arises is the SEC's customer protection rule was written in 1972 and doesn't address how a broker-dealer should hold a customer's blockchain private keys, for instance. Now, I know the SEC claims to have provided relief, but the relief has very onerous contingencies. It's time-limited, and my understanding is few, if any, broker-dealers have been able to comply. So I know you've said many times you want to have the industry, the intermediaries, come in and have a conversation with the SEC about this. But wouldn't it be better if the SEC came out and laid out how you would apply the rules and regulations to these novel devices?
So we're in conversations with a number of these intermediaries across the exchange, the lending, the broker-dealer, the custody space. As I've said a year ago, in the lending space, people should make no mistake. And I think it sounds like, Senator, you and I might even agree that the lending platforms are under the securities laws.
Right.
But in the exchange space and the broker-dealer space, I accept that people have not come in and used what was put in place under Chair Clayton, that broker-dealer custody rule that you mentioned. And so I've said to staff, let's use everything in our regulatory toolkit, whether it's exemptive orders and others, to help facilitate and get this industry. People will not have trust in this space unless it comes into investor protection.
So I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. So I would just say my concern is that the approach you're taking with these one-off discussions, if it did even result in an opportunity to comply, it'd be this idiosyncratic exemptive order negotiated with a single company. And that's not a good way to pass rules. It ought to be through the APA and a very public process.
If the chair would forgive me, I think we've been very clear through 70 or 80 actions, starting with that Dow order, the Munchie order, and many others, and they were full votes of the commission, they're not just staff. Secondly, I just look at other times in the history, the SEC and the asset-backed securities market took 10 or 11 years where they did these, as you would say, exemptive orders or relief to individual issuers, and did a rule at the end of that 10 or 11 years based upon all that experience. So we actually believe it's worthwhile to talk to the industry, talk to the market participants, and get them registered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Gensler, for being here as always. Recently, I led a group of my colleagues writing to you about your process for a significant number of proposals that the SEC has been working on over the last year. I would think that you would agree that it is important that there is sufficient opportunity for stakeholder input and feedback. One of those proposals that I've been hearing about is the enhancement and the standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. You probably know that I'm a farmer. This is my wife and I's 45th harvest, as a matter of fact. And as a working farmer, I can tell you that I can understand the importance of considering the impacts of climate change. This year was our second worst harvest due to drought. Last year, due to extreme weather conditions, was our worst harvest. So climate change is real, and it appears like it ain't going away. So we've got some issues to deal with. I also know, though, that access to capital and markets to sell our product and to produce our product is really important. And I can tell you I understand the burden of reporting information. I get surveys nearly every day about what I'm doing as a farmer. This week, there were a number of farm groups that were in that I visited with virtually and in person, a number of banks, and they were concerned about this rule. So from an production agriculture standpoint, as you also know, I don't have a lot of options as a farmer. I tell folks when I wake up in the morning and throw a couple 100 gallons of diesel fuel on a tractor, it's not like I've got an electric tractor in the garage that I can use. So I'm pretty well locked into fuel, diesel fuel, carbon-based fuel at this moment in time. So under this rule, what responsibility would folks in production agriculture, specifically Montana farmers, have for disclosing their emissions?
Thank you for that question. Presuming that those farmers are not public company, they don't come under the rule. But we have heard from various farm bureaus, and of course the American Farm Bureau Federation, Zippy Duval and I have talked about this, and maybe other members probably know Zippy. And public companies would have an obligation under the proposal with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, their own emissions, and then we say in the rule that they estimate their supply chain emissions if it's material. So it's got a materiality catch, but it's just that they estimate, and we've heard some folks in the farm and community. Thank you. The farm community, that they're concerned. And so we're taking a very close look at that amongst our 14,000 other comments on this.
So let me give you a scenario. Markets are really important. I like to direct market as much as I can, but not much is direct marketed off of my farm, okay? I sell to publicly owned companies, okay? Let's just take wheat, for example. I sell wheat to a publicly owned company, and they start doing their assessment on climate impacts, which I certainly don't have a problem with, by the way. What am I, as a farmer who sold them grain, for example, or you could say cattle, or pick a commodity. If the company says to me, look, if you're going to do business with me, I got to have all this information, what are my recourses?
What we put out, and again, we got some very good comments and we're working through this, is that public company you sell to does not have any obligation to ask you specifically. They either need to estimate, or if they don't have an estimate, just discuss how they're managing that scope 3. But I would say this is what the public comment process is about. We've heard from 14,000 other people, but particularly in the farm community, and how we sort of address this to lower the cost, because the intent, Senator, is not that whether it's the farm community or other community, if they're not public companies, they're not under this rule.
I've got it, but my concern, as I indicated with my previous statement, is we sell to public companies. I mean, the vast majority of the product that's sold is to a public company. And if the public, and I just bring this to your attention, and I don't want to repeat myself, but if the public company says, hey, we need you, John Tester, T-Bone Farms, to tell us how much fuel you used, how much fertilizer you used, what your inputs were, and all that, it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue, especially for the little guy who's out there running a tractor or fixing that tractor and doesn't have a lot of time to sit in the house behind a computer.
And I'll say two things. One is that's not the intent of what we did, particularly of how we did it with the safe harbor and only estimates. But two, that's the benefit of public comment. That's why this helps us. And of course, we'll put this hearing in the public record, in our public record as well.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Tillis from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to try and fulfill your expectation that some Republicans are going to bellyache during this hearing.
Thrilled you listened to my opening statement.
I did, and I also listened to Senator Toomey's. I've been watching this in my office, and want to get back to something that Senator Toomey mentioned. We've sent a oversight request several months ago. I think a follow-up on July the 21st, and looking for a written response to our oversight request. So, Chairman Gensler, I know your office in the initial response provided a one-page response that suggested that we meet with staff. I'm kind of curious when we could expect a specific written response to the oversight request that Republicans have sent you.
Sir, we do stand ready as staff to meet with your staff to walk through the process that we have on any role. We put out to the public in that release was in hundreds of pages, our economic analysis and the rationale and reasons for that.
About 500 pages long.
That is correct. That is correct. And we stand ready again to meet and walk through that process with you.
Then I guess maybe we can just get a commitment. There may be other members who are interested, but absent a written response, getting a commitment from you to meet so that we can go through and get the answers to the specific questions we had in the oversight request?
We stand ready to have staff meet to go through and generally talk about the process. I mean, I want to be careful because it's really about to talk about and try to address the questions that you have and the concerns. But again, this rule is rooted in decades of law, and it's about a conversation that's already going on between public companies and their investors. And investors, I think, would benefit if we can bring some consistency to this fragmented disclosure that's happening now.
We may follow up with staff, but we're going to continue. First, again, congratulations on your confirmation, but we're going to continue to press on answers to some of the specific questions. But thank you for that. The U.S. Treasury market is the single most important market in the world. Do you agree with that?
It's the base upon which the rest of our capital markets is.
It does a lot. It's important in monetary policy. It's important in protecting retirement savings for U.S. workers. We can run down a long list. I think your recent SEC proposal could inadvertently curtail involvement and liquidity in the Treasury market. I'm kind of curious, did the Commission really intend to require customers to register as dealers?
We put out a proposal earlier this year based on a 1986 law about dealer registration.
Yeah. My understanding is the proposal would classify any firm as a dealer if it transacts more than a specified amount per month. Is that true?
There was two prongs, but yes, it had over $25 billion a month.
So how would a pension fund that frequently transacts in the Treasury market and exceeds the trading threshold set by the Commission in order to protect the retirement savings of its members be considered a dealer under any common sense interpretation?
It's about whether you hold yourself out the statutory definition is about holding yourself out regularly and transacting in a marketplace. There is not, by the way, that number, and we go through this economics in the proposal, would not cover pension funds as we know it today.
So the nature of the trading would matter too?
So it's the size and scale of the Treasury market, as large as they are. It's also that their pension funds aren't trading at those types of level that you mentioned.
I've got a series of other questions, but it would take me probably longer to ask it than I have time remaining, so we will be submitting several questions for the record. And again, I want to go back to the oversight request. We need to kind of figure out how we can get the specific answers to the question. I'm happy to have my staff meet with you, but we would also like to get a formal written response to the request that we've now requested a response in writing. A discussion's good, but we'll continue to press for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Menendez.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gensler, the last time you came before the committee, I asked you to move expeditiously to adopt the Asset Management Advisory Committee's recommendations on diversity. And last October, 22 senators, including 9 members of this committee, sent you a letter supporting the recommendations and asking for immediate approval. Can you give us an update on the status of adopting these recommendations?
So I thank you, Senator. We've looked at, there was 4 recommendations, and there's some subpoints in those recommendations, and we working, and I think we've informed your staff about this with regard to 2 important ones in there. One is a recommendation around guidance, staff guidance on how asset managers are selected and whether their years of service or their assets under management could be need to be taken into consideration or not. And another one is with regard to EEO complaints and how those complaints are shared with other agencies and like. And I think we've made some good progress on those 2. I feel that the staff will probably shortly be putting out that guidance. And we continue to look at the other 2 matters.
Well, look, I appreciate that you're giving some of these recommendations serious attention. But at the same time, I must say I'm disappointed. In so many other areas, the SEC under your leadership has taken bold steps to protect consumers, to strengthen oversight of markets, such as your proposed climate risk disclosure rule. However, when presented with AMAC's non-controversial, unanimous recommendations that would promote diversity in the asset management field, you haven't been as aggressive. So can you commit to make concrete progress on these recommendations by the end of the year?
So, Senator, I take very seriously how important diversity, inclusion, equity is important broadly in our society, but to the SEC as an agency. Our senior leadership is probably the most diverse and inclusive that we've ever been as an agency. We continue to lean in to try to make sure that our agency, everybody can bring their best self to work and work, and that we get the benefit of the talent across this great nation. And in terms of policy, it's held up in court right now. But last year, a self-regulatory organization, NASDAQ, put in place a listing requirement with regard to their boards of directors and diversity, and that was their decision, not ours. It predated me, but we approved that. And on these 4 committee recommendations, as I said, I think we've made some pretty good progress on 2 of them. I think that guidance will be out in the near term, and we continue to work on the others.
Well, I'd like to highlight one of AMAC's recommendations that I think would be particularly impactful. The AMAC recommended that the SEC require enhanced disclosure by investment companies and investment advisors regarding diversity within their workforce and leadership. You and I have spoken about the importance of leadership diversity at your confirmation hearing. I just heard your comments now. I think that disclosures about diversity are incredibly important, which is why I introduced the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act. Do you agree that enhancing diversity disclosures for advisory firms, investment company boards, and consultants would empower investors and fund managers to make more informed decisions?
Again, as I said, I think that we benefit in our organization at the SEC and in our great nation by tapping into the talents across this our diverse nation, and we're continue to look at this recommendation of AMAC with regard to disclosures.
Well, one of the key findings of the AMAC study is that, and for my colleagues, AMAC is an advisory board that is created, under the, I believe it's the SEC, So one of their findings is that, quote, investment performance by diverse asset managers is equal to or greater than the investment performance of firms that lack diversity in ownership and senior leadership, despite differences in size and length of track record. And that's why they recommended that the SEC issue guidance clarifying that fulfillment of fiduciary duty does not require automatic exclusion of asset managers who are new to the industry or do not meet a certain threshold of assets under management. In your view, is it necessary for fiduciaries to automatically exclude newer or smaller asset managers in order to fulfill their duty?
Senator, on the guidance, I share that view, I think, that you just said, and I think that's the guidance that the staff is working on to put out. And you're right, the AMAC is a federal advisory committee. It's under the FACA committee laws.
Let me close by saying, fundamentally, using the excuse of fiduciary duty to exclude women and minority-led firms runs contrary to the actual data. AMAC's study, along with a host of other studies by McKinsey, for example, and others, have repeatedly shown that diversely led firms outperform their non-diverse counterparts. And so, given this data, I think that we can agree that new or smaller asset managers being automatically excluded under the guise of fiduciary duty is actually not helping investors, it's harming them. And so that's why I've been pressing on these issues. We'll continue to work with you. We hope to have a robust response by the commission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here today. I want to also thank you for you and your colleagues' good work on implementing the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Can you give us a quick overview about where we are? China, I understand, has come to the negotiating table and you've negotiated a statement of protocol. Could you give us an update on the status of your good efforts?
Yes, and again, I want to thank you because Senator Van Hollen just came in and you shepherded that through. And I think that the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act gave us the additional leverage to work with Chair Williams down at the PCOB, and we had numerous meetings with the Chinese. We said to the Chinese last August, a year plus ago, that we wouldn't be willing to send the inspectors over to China to look at the audit work papers and the like, unless we could get a very detailed, prescriptive statement of protocol to effectuate the will of Congress. And at its core, it's that how can you trust the numbers in these Chinese companies unless there's somebody in the U.S. who's auditing the auditor, so to speak, technically inspecting and investigating. Mm-hmm. They did sign that. We thought it was important to get that signed. The PCOB is sending inspectors over. I think they're on flights tomorrow because I think it starts Monday the 19th. And it takes about 8 to 10 weeks to get through. So we'll probably know somewhere around Thanksgiving or early December. And I don't know if the Chinese are going to comply. They've told me. I mean, the Ministry of Finance have told me directly on WebEx calls, and the China Securities Regulatory Commission has said they will comply. And it's pretty clear. No redactions in the work papers. Take testimony from whomever the PCOB needs to take testimony from. They can onward share the information to us, and they can pick whichever companies they want to look at.
I'm not sure they'll comply either, but they move further toward compliance than at any point in the past. Senator Van Hollen and I have a bill that's passed the Senate, as you know, being considered by the House to move the deadline from 3 years to 2 years, with respect to which, if they don't comply, we tell them to leave our exchanges, and I think that might help if we can get that passed, and I appreciate your good efforts there. In my last 2 minutes, I wanted to shift gears on the climate risk disclosure, and I don't mean to be critical. I'm trying to understand, because I thought Senator Tester raised some very good questions. What's your best guess of the cost of compliance with your climate risk disclosure rules?
So, one, I do support your accelerating Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act to
Thank
2 years versus 3, because I think it will continue to have the right leverage, even if the Chinese authorities, the Chinese regulators allow for compliance this year. What about next year? What about next year? So I do support that.
Thank you.
In terms of the climate role, we lay out in this proposal all the economic analysis, and I don't mean to speak for the numbers in that, but by company.
What's your best guess, if you could? I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but I've only got a minute left. What's your best guess of the cost of it to comply?
So per company, we lay that out, and depending on the size, and I just don't want to misspeak, it's, from a couple $100,000 to, I
What's the
apologize,
total,
$1 billion.
though?
And the total cost, I think Senator Toomey accurately quoted it. You weren't maybe in the room. It's measured in the single-digit billions across the entire economy. Okay. But what we benefit from is also people are coming in and giving us critical analysis of whether we're accurate.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm gonna run out of time. Here's my question. It'll cost billions of dollars to comply. Those are scarce resources. To the extent that people like Senator Tester have to spend the money to comply, they can't spend the money on something else. Presumably, the purpose of the rule is to focus investors' attention on the risk of climate change so that they will demand that companies do a better job. The purpose of which is to lower the world's temperatures. Am I okay? Am I doing
No, actually, but that's not the purpose. The purpose, I mean, I can speak for the 5-member commission, but also for myself. We're not a merit regulator. So the purpose actually is not to do what you said. It's just for investors to get the information.
I think the people supporting the rule, that's their intention.
That's not why I support it.
Okay, fair enough. But I think that's what most people expect. You put pressure on the companies to disclose, shareholders put pressure, people do better job. But I'd like to see, while you're asking Senator Tester and the other people to estimate, I would like to see some sort of estimate of how much all this money spent on compliance is going to lower world temperatures. I mean, we're spending, I believe in clean air and bright water. I want to be able to eat and live indoors. But what bothers me is, while we're spending these trillions of dollars of scarce resources, India and China gets 60% of its energy from coal. China has 3,500 coal fueled power plants. We've got less than 100. We don't have any kind of agreement with India or China for them to reduce emissions. So we spend all of this money and world temperatures are not reduced. And you give me
Chair
your thoughts?
Gensler, answer the question briefly. Thank you.
The good news is that's not what our authorities are or what motivates this one commissioner. It's about actually helping investors get more consistent information, even if they want to invest in what might be brown assets rather than green assets. They will get more consistent information and will probably lower some of the greenwashing that's out there and other things like that.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Senator Kennedy. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great to see you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see an SEC chairman from the great state of Maryland.
It's great to see my senator.
Yeah, right. Let me just pick up on the first point that Senator Kennedy raised in terms of implementation of the Holding Foreign Countries Accountable Act. I just want to thank you and your team for pursuing that. I also agree we should shorten the time period to 2 years, and I want to thank Senator Kennedy for his work on this. The idea, of course, was to make sure we protect American investors, especially smaller investors, by ensuring that all companies listed on our exchanges comply with our accounting rules. And I know you had very tough negotiations with China. Thank you for keeping us informed. The ultimate proof is in the pudding, right? Their execution of it. But I do want to salute you and your team for all your efforts to date on that. I also want to thank you for moving ahead on a rulemaking to crack down on abuses of 10b5-1 trading plans by insiders. At the beginning of this Congress, Senator Fisher and I introduced legislation directing the SEC to undertake such a rulemaking. You did it, and we are monitoring that carefully. I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article back in June, which I think, along with other studies, revealed clear abuses by insiders in these areas. And of course, when insiders benefit, it means the investors lose often, because sometimes these are gamed to take the gains before the overall value of a company decreases stock value. So I want to thank you for that, and we're monitoring that. I also want to thank you and your team for recognizing the real issue of fraudulent scams, security scams, often directed against seniors. These amount to up to $3 billion every year. And we have a bipartisan bill here that I know the chairman and the ranking member are probably tired of hearing of, but I appreciate their I think, support for the bill, which is to empower states to better crack down on this fraud by creating a grant, federal grant through the SEC to help them out. And we've heard testimony on behalf of state insurance commissioners and state securities commissioners strongly indicating their support. So you recognize this is a big problem that we should deal with, do you not?
Oh, I do. I think that fraud in, as you said, in the elder community, or sometimes it's affinity-based fraud, we see all too much of it at the SEC in our weekly enforcement meetings.
I'm sure you do, and that we want to pass this legislation just to better fortify states to crack down on this kind of fraud. We're working with you on the ticker legislation as well, Senator Scott from Florida and I want to ask you about something you and I have spoken about before, which is country-by-country reporting disclosures by big multinational corporations. We're seeing jurisdictions around the world, including the EU and now Australia, move toward increased disclosure requirements for large multinational corporations to disclose the countries in which they book profits and pay taxes as a way to mitigate tax risk to investors. We have a changing international tax environment, and clearly companies that have put a lot of eggs in putting their profits in sketchy tax havens, their investors are at risk. And that's why we believe, as part of providing investors with necessary information, we should provide country-by-country disclosures. I was pleased to see the SEC take steps to protect investors' interest in May by allowing them to put forward a proposal at Amazon's shareholder meeting that would ask the company to disclose its country-by-country reporting. So my question, Mr. Chairman, is in this rapidly changing international cooperation tax landscape, can you look at this question about whether new investor disclosures are needed in this area?
So, Senator, I thank you, and we are looking at it, and as I discussed with you when we got together on the phone, the Financial Accounting Standards Board actually has a project, and we sometimes, let them know, and I want to say publicly here, I support the Financial Accounting Standards Board's project around breaking out and disaggregating tax reporting for public companies. I believe that, I don't want to speak for them, but in the next handful of months, they're going to go forward, and it breaks out, I don't think every country, but I think the top, couple of handfuls of countries, and then they'll, sort of promulgate that, get public feedback, and back and forth. But I think that it would be a productive approach to have such disaggregation that FASB is considering right now and has an active project on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may have some questions to submit for the record, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator House. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Gensler, it's good to see you. Thank
Good to
you
see
for
you.
being here. Let me talk a little bit about crypto regulation. Under your tenure, the SEC has pursued enforcement actions against crypto asset insurers. However, few cases have been brought against the exchanges. And crypto assets are, as we know, traded primarily through the exchanges. The SEC has proposed that intermediaries should be regulated under the Exchange Act. So could you address this? Why should crypto asset intermediaries and exchanges be regulated under the Exchange Act? And if you would, how would investors and market participants benefit from regulating crypto assets under the Exchange Act?
So I thank you. It's actually fairly straightforward because of these 10,000 crypto tokens, without prejudging any one of them, I believe that the vast majority are securities because there's somebody in the public is betting on a better future, betting on anticipating profits on a common enterprise, a group of entrepreneurs in the middle. And then given that, these intermediaries that often have 50 or 500 tokens or 150 tokens, they're going to have a bunch of securities on that platform. How does it benefit the public? It's the time-tested protections that these crypto exchanges, we protect against front running and manipulation, and there's transparency. As you go into the New York Stock Exchange or into NASDAQ or the like, this committee's worked on laws long ago. I complimented Chair Fletcher, who was here in 1934 and did it, but long ago for that very reason, the public benefits. Right now, frankly, there's a fair amount of non-compliance. And so we're going to continue to try to work with the intermediaries, get them inside and regulated. If need be, use our toolkit, our regulatory toolkit to adjust and facilitate, because there are some differences, as Senator Toomey and I talked about earlier.
Would you be able to, through the enforcement, also identify potential money laundering activity?
It's more the remit of the Department of Treasury. However, one of the key things under, as I understand the money laundering laws, the SEC has a role that our registrants, the exchanges, the broker-dealers, have certain compliance obligations over with Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at Treasury once they register, or whether they should register. And I believe it's even if they don't register, but they're legally required to, they have to comply with that.
Thank you. Excuse me, let me jump back to, because I do think Senator Kennedy, and I appreciate his willingness to explore, to understand the issue of ESG and the requirement. My understanding, and thank you for your position and how you perceive that regulation, but because now we have a whole new generation of investors that are really conscious about green and going green, there are new investors now that are looking for ways to invest to be consistent with their values in this role, correct?
There are also investors that are just thinking, because of climate risk, it could affect the financial performance of a company, it could affect their supply chain, it could affect their competition, it could affect future regulation. So they're thinking about how to value today that future transition risk.
Thank you. And then there was also conversation, and I appreciate this as well, about the issue of greenwashing. And I know some major global asset managers and climate advocates have stated that the ESG integration label could pose greenwashing risk. Can you talk a little bit about that and address that?
So there are asset managers managing trillions of dollars that are saying to the public, we will invest your money, your money in something that's carbon neutral or green and the like. And so to me, it's about truth in advertising. And so we put out some proposals earlier this year to address what stands behind a name, literally the name of a fund, and are you living up to the obligations that you made or commitments you made to your investors when you asked for their money? And I think that's really important about the integrity, and it would address some of this, what's sometimes called greenwashing.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Rounds from South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I was going to start out today visiting a little bit about farmers and ranchers, but I understand that Senator Tester beat me to it. And I think the fact that we really do have a concern about the ambiguities that some of our farmers and ranchers have right now with what they're going to be expected to try to share with providers of products to them with regard to downstream environmental impacts really is of concern. And the ambiguity at which it's been left with what can be guesstimates and so forth is something that I really think you need to take a second look at.
Senator, I concur with you as we talked in the ante room earlier. We thought the proposal had the right balance because we said it's only an estimate. It's only public companies. It's only if it's material or they made a commitment to it and they have a big safe harbor. But we heard a lot from the farm bureaus, and so we're that's what we do. We take a look of all the public comments and see how we can ensure that it doesn't touch those private actors.
And that's precisely what I really wanted to talk about it's one thing with the rules. It's another thing when there is an expectation that once the rules have been established, if they're really ambiguous, then that means that each time they have to come back to a regulator to ask whether or not what they're doing is accurate or not. And I think that causes some serious concerns for people that want to invest. So I just simply say, look, I mean, if you're making rules on these, and clearly you are making rules, a lot of them, let's be as precise as we can in them. And I think that'll eliminate a lot of the questions that are coming up, sir. Let me go into just a couple of items very quickly here. At a speech that you delivered last week, you quoted Joseph Kennedy saying, "No honest business should fear the SEC." You went on to say that given the nature of crypto investments, I recognize that it may be appropriate to be flexible in applying existing disclosure requirements. Matt Levine openly questioned that sentiment on a column for Bloomberg, stating the SEC has been suing crypto projects for illegally issuing securities for about 5 years now, but put in that time, it has not issued any rules or proposed any rules or put anything on its rulemaking agenda about adapting the securities and disclosure rules for crypto projects. I echo Mr. Levine's comments. It seems to me that you want to regulate an entire marketplace, but clearly it doesn't appear that you've got rules in place to do so at this time. In my mind, this is simply unacceptable. And I know that your background in the private sector you've got a great history in the private sector, so this is kind of confusing to us. I've heard from a variety of companies who claim they try to work with you and with your organization, but then you turn around and then you've hit them with some pretty heavy enforcement actions or slow walk the process. Mr. Chairman, you keep telling crypto entrepreneurs and the companies to come in and to register. Has anyone actually tried to do that?
To answer your question, there's 6 companies that are actually registered under the disclosure regimes. I would say this, not liking the answer from the SEC doesn't mean there isn't guidance, just with all fairness. And most of these tokens, the vast majority, are securities, and thus the intermediaries are likely to be in non-compliance with securities laws right now. So we're really trying to work with them. We're talking to a wide swath of these organizations right now to get them properly registered, to get them inside the remit. And this is what we do. With all respect to Mr. Levine, we've been pretty clear. My predecessor, Chair Clayton, was through commission actions and in his public voice in front of this committee and others about this matter. And we're going to continue to protect the public as best we can.
Thank you. As of August 2022, the SEC had proposed 32 new rules in just 11 months and is preparing at least another 19 for release in the next year. These are complex rulemakings that will greatly impact markets and capital formation. In addition to that, these rules are being implemented in an overlapping timeline and affect the same or interconnected financial products and market sectors. However, despite the linkages between the various proposals, the SEC has assessed the economic impact of each rule independently and in isolation from the others. Implementing these proposals simultaneously without consideration of the cumulative and cross-sector effects will most certainly lead to unintended consequences. Mr. Chairman, why has the SEC not considered the cumulative and the cross-sector effects when simultaneously implementing these proposals that most certainly could lead to negative and unintended consequences for our capital markets and broader economy?
Senator, we actually do consider cross, even within any one of the 30, it's actually as of yesterday, 34 to bring you up to date.
Moving along.
Moving along. I would note that Chair Clayton, during his 4 years, did a little over 60 final rules. We have about 50 on our docket. So and Chair Shapiro and Chair White were about the same 40 to 60 range during their 4 years. We might have been a little sooner getting them out to proposals. But we do consider those cross issues. I mean, and sometimes we even reopen proposals for that reason, like we did with stock lending and stock buyback. And we reopened because there was this cross consideration. We've done it in some other areas. We're even looking now whether we should do that in some areas and reopen some for that cross consideration. But lastly, I would say we get comment letters after the comment period as well. And we you know, this is over the years, and we do it now. Staff reads them, they put them in. It tends to take us months, sometimes a year to 18 months to finalize a rule after it's proposed.
Thank you. I wish we could continue the conversation, but my time has
I think you still
expired.
have my cell phone number, so you can call me anytime, sir.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Rounds. Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Brown and Ranking Member. It's interesting, just apropos of Senator Round's comments and questions about crypto. I was not here earlier because I was at the Banking Committee where we were having a conversation about issues. I mean, I was at the Ag Committee, pardon me. I know, where am I? See, I'm a little confused. I've been running around. Anyway, I just note that there are a handful of us, you, Senator Brown, and Senator Warnock, and I, that serve on both agriculture and banking housing, and as the issues of how we should create a regulatory framework for crypto commodities, digital commodities, as well as digital securities. I think we have an important job to do here. Chair Gensler, on the, I want to go to the question of materiality. On securities laws, they are grounded in the concept of materiality. And since we've emerged from the Great Depression, we've acknowledged that investing in the stock market comes with its risks. But investors ought to have information about that they need to be able to prudently evaluate those risks and make good informed decisions. And this is especially important today as more than half of families have investments in the stock market, including their retirement nest eggs. So could you talk to the committee, just broadly speaking, about how climate disclosures for public companies are material information for investors?
It's material because, as the Supreme Court says, substantial likelihood a reasonable investor is considering it significant in their mix of information. And right now, it's really remarkable what's happened in the last 10 to 20 years. So many investors are considering it. And why are they considering it? Because there's a future chance of transition risk. They might have to change their operations. Their competitors might change their operations. Laws might change. These companies that are listed here in the U.S. operate around the globe. On average, if you look at the top 500 or 1,000 companies, half their operations are overseas. And so it can affect all that. But it's material because, as the Supreme Court says, because investors get to decide what risk they take, and investors are saying it. In our comment file, if you look at the top 300 or 400 of the investors, the big asset managers, it adds up to $50 trillion of assets under management that have come in, mostly supportive of this. I mean, I know that there's a lot of good discussion about what do we do about the farmers and not getting caught up in Scope 3, and which is a good conversation we've had. But mostly the investor community has come in in these 14,000 comments supportive.
And it's good for those investors to be able to understand what those risks are in a more comprehensive and clear way.
Absolutely, and investors get to decide. If somebody says, I think those risks are significant, but a company's managing it well, I should invest in it. They might say that, I think that the market is overpricing a stock, and they might say, I want to sell that stock because I don't think this, I think that assets that are emitting a lot of emissions are still going to be really profitable. That's up to investors.
On another topic I want to touch base on, I was pleased to see the SEC take action to increase transparency and accountability in the private fund market. Private funds, including private equity and hedge funds, have an outsized presence in our economy, $18 trillion in assets. And a substantial portion of that, again, includes retirement savings held in pension plans for teachers and municipal employees and others. And in recent years, individual ownership of private funds has also been on the rise. So, Chair Gensler, can you talk about the recently proposed amendments to Form PF and the private fund advisor rules, and how they would, how they interact with eliminating conflicts of interest issues, protect investors, and protect the integrity of the private fund market?
So we've done two sets of rules with regard to private funds. One, to promote greater efficiency. What that means is lowering the cost of this. It's actually grown since that number, about 21 trillion. And they probably take revenues of about $300 billion plus. And that means those teachers, firefighters, those pensioners are getting a little lower potentially return. So it helps them. So we're trying to promote greater efficiency, transparency of fees, performance, and side letters. You mentioned a form called Form PF, Form Private Fund. That is something that was put in place after the 2008 crisis. Congress thought the SEC and our sibling agency, the CFTC, should get more information about these funds with regard to mitigating and monitoring for systemic risk, the big crisis of 2008. And we're updating those forms.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Lummis from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your holding this hearing on the important work of the SEC. And Chairman Gensler, it's great to see you again. And so I want to dive into a component of the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, which you've had a chance to see, that deals with Section 301 of that bill. I agree with statements you and your predecessor, Jay Clayton, have made that initial coin offerings where digital assets are sold to investors expecting to profit from the seller's efforts should be considered investment contracts. Senator Gillibrand and I share your concerns about information gaps that can arise when digital assets are later used and traded by others, and the need to ensure users can make informed decisions in the market. So we believe that it is those that raise the money through an initial sale of digital assets and those that continue to provide essential managerial efforts should be held responsible to provide disclosures to the market, and that innocent secondary purchasers of digital assets that may or may not be aware that they're trading in securities should not be subject to strict liability. So in our act, the Responsible Financial Innovation Act, rather than attempting to impose new, complex, difficult to apply rules on secondary purchasers not involved in fundraising transactions, Section 301 of our bill provides for robust technology-neutral disclosure obligations that would hold responsible those who benefited from that fundraising, not the innocent users of digital assets who have no way of knowing what the sponsor is up to. So my question is this: do you have any thoughts on the need for disclosures in the digital asset markets and Section 301 of our bill?
So I thank you for the question. It was good to meet with you and Senator Gillibrand and discuss these as well. I think that the disclosure, as you say, is key. We even recently we're setting up a new industry office to help the disclosure in this field in our corporate finance area. I do think that as you say, the innocent purchaser, let's say the public does not have a disclosure obligation when they buy a stock on the New York Stock Exchange, and it's not the public that should have a disclosure obligation if they buy some crypto security token. But the entrepreneurs, the sponsor, the promoter, the entrepreneurs, that's where the disclosure obligation ought to be. And I think we have authorities now to facilitate and actually have a different set of disclosures, just as we have in other fields. We have different disclosures on something called asset-backed securities than we do for equities. But I do think where I might respectfully differ from, I think, what might be in the question is that I think in the secondary market, 5 years after a stock is issued, a stock of a great U.S. company is issued, there's still a disclosure obligation. And I think that's what Congress did. In 1933, passed a law saying you've got to make a disclosure if you raise money from the public, but the Congress knew that wasn't enough. And in 34, they came back and said, you know what? We also have to cover the secondary market in two ways. Cover the intermediaries, like the stock exchange and the broker-dealers, but also say that there's got to be what's known as periodic reporting, the annual report. And so, or maybe there's no difference here, but I think the investor should not have an obligation. It's the intermediaries, and then it's the common enterprise or the folks in the middle.
And are you thinking that disclosure option or obligation would be similar for initial coin offerings under our bill, or should be under our bill, similar disclosure options as were instituted in 1934?
I think similar in kind, but probably there's some things, it might be a little bit different list. I mean, there might not be a board of directors and things like that. So I really do think your bill had a list. We might differ on that list. We might have other things to put on that list. But it's not necessarily, as you say, everything that a big multinational company is doing.
Okay. Well, I want you to know that Senator Gillibrand and I want to continue to work with you and your staff to make sure that, to the extent that we don't philosophically disagree, that any of those sorts of gaps that you have identified in our bill can be addressed, because I don't see our bill having an avenue to come before this committee or the Congress before the end of the year. But we do intend to have it, to reintroduce it in January. And we want to make sure that between now and January, we've worked with you and your staff to make sure that we can address items that we can mutually agree need to be in the bill.
I look forward to that, and particularly, as I said earlier, in ways that we can ensure we don't undermine the $100 trillion capital market, the definition of security, the definitions of other things that really are under this committee and stay under this committee.
And we've talked about unintended consequences of our bill before with you. We want to address those unintended consequences. Obviously, you see things that maybe we don't because of your perspective. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Really appreciate your being here today, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Senator. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Gensler, great to see you. Thanks for your service. Thank you for your testimony.
Senator Ossoff, good to see you again.
I have routinely asked you this question. I've also put this question periodically to Chair Powell and to Secretary Yellen. What do you see as the most significant threats to financial stability? Or to put it another way, what keeps you up at night?
You don't want me to say my daughters. Okay. Look, I think in terms of we are living in uncertain times. I don't need to say this, but with the war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, with central banks around the globe moving from accommodating to tightening, with the remaining, challenges, geopolitical challenges between great nations and also with COVID, and commodity prices. All of that in the mix. What I look at and think about is the relationship between the banking sector and the hedge fund sector and investors, the relationship between the banking sector and commodity traders. That's called a prime brokerage relationship, and those relationships I really do think a lot about. I think about resiliency in the market, and that's why we have about a dozen or 15 projects. In the treasury market, what we're trying to do, in money market funds and open-end funds, shortening the settlement cycle and the like. I think that if we do our job well at the SEC, we'll build greater resiliency for the stresses that come in the future. And those stresses come because that's what an economy, we always have ups and downs in economies. So we have these longer term projects, but near term, it's these issues that I just raised.
Let's talk a little bit about the Treasury market. You highlighted that in previous testimony. You issued proposed rulemaking in the last several days. Can you please break down into layperson's terms the nature of concern about illiquidity in Treasury markets and how the actions you're proposing to consider taking would address them?
So I would say to the American public, it's a big market. It's a quarter of our entire capital markets, $24 trillion. You can think of it as the base. It's sort of the foundation of our financial house. Everything else is built upon the Treasury market. And what we've found is we've had real disruptions, call them jitters. I hate to say it in the house way. It's like there's some termites somewhere in the foundation every few years. We had them in the 1980s and 1990s, and we had them in the last 6 years. And it puts some pressure on our central bank, the Federal Reserve, that sometimes then opens up and provides, using its balance sheet, liquidity to the marketplace, sort of as a lender of last resort. I think that we can lower the risk in that marketplace by ensuring that all the dealers, the high-frequency trading dealers, are registered and regulated. Secondly, that where the trading happens, these are trading platforms, are regulated, and some of those aren't. And really importantly, getting the benefits of something that sounds boring, but it's called clearing. It's the back office, which lowers risk in the system. So those are the main things. We've worked really closely with Secretary Yellen and her team and Chair Powell and his team on those proposals.
Do you think that the persistent concern about illiquidity in Treasury markets threatens the Fed's ability to execute open market operations in a crisis?
I think, if I might say, if we do these suite of proposals in the Treasury market, it will bring greater competition. There historically was a group of primary dealers, then that started to broaden out to these principal trading firms, high-frequency trading firms, and others. And I think that we'll build greater resiliency and also increase some competition in the marketplace.
Okay, let's follow up on this, and I'll have my office get with yours.
And I'd love to have a meeting.
And with my brief remaining time, I want to ask about something of particular concern to Georgians. We have thriving military communities, base communities, veteran communities in Georgia. The SEC has, in the past and as recently as December of 2021, filed emergency action to shut down a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that targeted retirement funds held by veterans. I'd like to ask for your commitment that under your leadership, the SEC will redouble and intensify its efforts to ensure that within your jurisdiction, you are identifying and cracking down on schemes that could defraud or harm America's veterans.
You have that, and I would also say to all Georgians and veterans, if you see something, we have a TIPS complaint referral system. We have a whistleblower system. Please let us know. Let the SEC know. We're a little understaffed. I think we should have more staff, but let us know. We'll try to follow up and pursue those leads as people see them.
We'll pass that along.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Haggerty from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Chair Gensler, I was reviewing your testimony last night, and I was struck by a term that you used as you described the nation's securities laws and regulations. You described them as the gold standard, and I don't believe that's true anymore. What we've seen here in America over the past 2 decades is the number of publicly listed companies decline by more than 40%. If you look at the U.S. share of global IPOs, we've shrunk to less than 20% in the past decade. Why is that? It's because every new regulatory requirement that you impose on public companies adds to the already crippling cost of operating as a public company. So the consequence of all these regulations is to encourage companies to stay private or to look abroad to do their IPO. You've rolled out 32 proposed rules in the past year, including your ESG disclosure rule, which will cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year in compliance cost and has created tremendous uncertainty in the marketplace. This will undoubtedly make matters worse. America had such a big lead in terms of having the world's best capital markets that have allowed business to succeed here and thrive. But it's been in spite of, not because of, this increasingly crushing red tape. More regulation is a recipe for the preeminence of American capital markets to die a slow death. If we continue down this path, there won't be any investors left to protect. American workers, American consumers, and retirees can't afford that. So, Chairman Gensler, under your tenure at the SEC, you've rolled out an unprecedented slate of aggressive rule proposals. Among the many troubling trends in your short term as chairman has been an expansion of the SEC's purview into sophisticated markets under the guise of, quote, consumer protection. Because not all markets are accessible to retail investors, the SEC has traditionally adopted differentiated levels of paternalism depending on the given market. But the 2 most egregious examples of this creep that's happening right now are the private funds rule and the SEC's announcement that it would begin to force significant disclosure requirements on fixed income securities, including those that are regulated under Rule 144A. And your staff claims that these new rules will, quote, enhance investor protection. But as you know, the qualified investors that invest in these products are not unsophisticated. They don't need hand-holding in performing their own due diligence. Yet these new rules will pose significant new costs, and they'll act as an impediment to American innovators who need early-stage capital to grow. So my question to you is, do you think that the distinction between large and mostly institutional investors versus mom-and-pop investors is somehow unimportant? Or is there some other motivation that's driving the SEC under your guidance to dedicate so many resources to go after these larger investors, these investors that all of your predecessors, I think, rightly have given a degree of autonomy to?
So, Senator, I think that there is a distinction between what's called accredited investors and non-accredited investors. But I do think in the private funds rule, if I can address that, this is now a $21 trillion assets under management that the general partners, the asset managers who oppose what we're doing, I understand that. But those asset managers probably collect over $300 billion a year in revenue. And what does that mean? That means the issuers on one side and the investors on the other side have that $300+ billion in the middle. Now, I think that you gave us a responsibility to look to promote competition and efficiency in these markets. You did it in 1976 in law. You did it in 1996 in law twice, that we have that responsibility. So in that proposal, we took a lot of the recommendations from a group of limited partners, state pension funds, state treasurers, and a group called ILPA, and we looked at them and said, how can we promote greater competition through transparency to those investors, those sophisticated investors?
Your suggestion is that this is going to lower the cost of investment? This is going to increase the cost with these increased regulatory requirements. Where are you going with this?
Yeah, I think that we might have a healthy debate on this, but I think that actually when you've got general partners that are taking $300 billion out of the economy, this will help promote greater competition.
Increased regulatory cost promotes greater competition in the sophisticated market. I don't buy that one bit.
It's greater transparency to the investors of the fees and performance.
These are sophisticated investors, Mr. Chairman. This is damaging to the marketplace. I've been on the other side of the table there. Small companies that need to access capital to grow are going to be deprived of that capital because of this type of overreach. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Haggerty, Senator Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to stay on this topic for a moment, not Senator Haggerty's point, but, I do think from a historic basis, as we've talked, and good to see you again, Mr. Chairman, that you are in that range of what your predecessors have done. But I do think, it is an aggressive agenda. And candidly, a lot of it I support. I may disagree with some of my colleagues on the other side. But because you've been moving quickly, one of the things I'd like, and this follows up a little bit on Senator Round's comments, I'd like you to fill in a little more, both on how you make sure that you determine appropriate comment times. And I know in some of these regulations, you've extended the comment time. Some of them I do feel have been too short. But I'd like to also give me a little more specificity about this interaction, not simply in terms of total economic costs, but possible conflict. I'm going to come back and follow up for a moment on cybersecurity areas. But I just would like to get this sense, if all of these regs actually get passed by the commission, how are you holistically looking at their interoperability? Drill down on that a little bit.
No, I think it's a good question. We do it proposal by proposal in the economic analysis. We benefit from the public comment. And I would say we have a long tradition of, regardless of what the comment period is, 60 days or whatever the comment period is, when comments come in after the comment period, the staff considers it, we write it up, we put it in. I mean, if it comes in, not at the one day before we're finalizing it, generally, on average, takes a year and a half to finalize these things. So I encourage people to continue to say if you see that interaction. But secondly, we also occasionally, publicly we reopen something. And we did that earlier this year there was a security lending and a stock buyback, and we sort of reopened, and we sort of said, well, those are so closely interrelated. Let's do that as well.
And again, that's, again, as you're focusing within your purview, let me give you an area that I've got, I think, two well-intentioned rules, but I worry about conflict. Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I think the cybersecurity issues in my litany of things that keep me up at night, that's one of the ones. Matter of fact, I'm surprised we've not seen more from Russia in light of the invasion of Ukraine. We worked in a bipartisan way really hard to get a across-the-board mandatory cyber incident reporting legislation through, and trying to find the right timing of when you make that report and making sure that you don't interfere with the criminal investigation. You've got a similar SEC public company requirement, because I do believe a lot of these cyber incidents fall into materiality. But take a few minutes, because I wanted to get to one other quick question after this. Take a moment or two and tell me how you do that potential interaction between something that's outside your purview, this DHS CISA requirement, versus your SEC cybersecurity requirement.
It's a very good question, because the securities laws are about those investors understanding a material risk and a material events. And so we put out a proposal, as you said, about corporate public companies making cyber disclosure, how they manage cyber risk, and when they have a material incident. It's got to be a material incident, and then report that within 4 days. We've also been in conversation directly with the Department of Justice and with the Department of Homeland Security's, the particular leadership there, and had really good conversations. We included one important question in that proposal about national security, and we could tell you about, it would take more than the 50 seconds later to tell you about that, and working with the Department of Justice on that.
Well, the more you can, I think, spell out, maybe not just here, but how the process of this intersection between, an agenda, again, that I generally support, I think would make sense. And to show that, I want to use my last 30 seconds to touch on a topic that I've, candidly, your predecessor, Jay Clayton, started down this path, and you and I have talked about a lot before, and actually encourage more action, and that's in human capital reporting. I think we've discussed many times, I think many of my colleagues have heard me go through this litany about how assets on a balance sheet have changed dramatically from tangible assets to intangible. A lot of that's human capital. Chair Brown and I have some disclosure legislation on this. I've been a big advocate of a human capital R&D tax credit. Talk to me a little bit about how you think moving forward, because I do believe human capital investment is extraordinarily material for all these companies that say their workforce is their most important asset. Speak to that if you can.
So you're right. Chair Clayton did put out a rule. We've now have 2 years of the following of that rule around human capital. We're looking at those first 2 years and seeing what worked, what didn't work, and everything. But I know this from my days when I was on Wall Street. When you bought or sold a company, there were those 2 or 3 key pages with the key statistics about the workforce, turnover rates, what they got paid, what were the benefits, et cetera, what's the training like, are they unionized? I mean, these were the key things when you buy and sell a company. And so why shouldn't the public shareholders also get that similar information? And you had wrote recently about a letter that I think a number of former SEC commissioners from Joe Grunfest to Rob Jackson and others wrote, and we're taking a look at that letter as well.
Well, I'd encourage and look forward to working with you on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator from Virginia. Senator Daines from Montana.
Good to see you again, Senator.
We did not do that on purpose, even though you probably think we did.
I hope not.
I would never assume that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Daines.
All right. Chairman Gensler, I want to cut right to the chase here. I know some of my colleagues have already talked about the proposed climate disclosure rule. I've looked at it. I think it truly is beyond unreasonable, and I would recommend it be withdrawn. The massive burdens that it will place, not just on large companies, but also smaller companies, is going to have, I think, major downstream impacts on the companies with whom they also do business. And I really want to zero in on the Scope 3 emissions problem. The question, do you really think it's reasonable to ask companies to collect, analyze, reconcile, report on things?
All right, so we are at that time that I did tell you would have to come here. I'm going to have to step away. More on climate disclosure rules, as you can see. That seems to be the major topic of the day. I'm going to go ahead and post in the chat the link to the direct feed from the Senate Banking Committee, and you can continue to watch there. I unfortunately do have to go. Not too much really